Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andy Forsyth, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Ridgefield Library. Our program tonight is part of the Votes for Women Ridgefield Celebrates the 19th Amendment series of events commemorating the women's suffrage movement. This evening's program is supported by a grant from CT Humanities. Program partners for this year-long series are the Ridgefield Library, the Ridgefield Historical Society, the Drumhill chapter of the DAR, Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, and the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Marilyn Carroll, the president of the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield.
Thank you so much, Andy. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Gloria J. Browne-Marshall to our audience tonight. In researching the suffrage movement for the Votes for Women exhibit and selecting speakers for our series of events, the Votes for Women Committee realized that the contributions African American women made to the movement have historically been ignored or completely overlooked. What little is taught about the suffrage movement in schools really touches on the racism and discrimination within the suffrage organizations and the steps African American women needed to have their voices heard. That is why we are honored to have Dr. Browne-Marshall with us today to talk about African American suffragettes and Black women voters. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Browne-Marshall. Gloria J. Browne-Marshall is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and teaches classes in constitutional law, race in the law, evidence, and gender and justice. She taught in the Africana Studies program at Vassar College prior to coming to John Jay, and is a civil rights attorney who has litigated cases for the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama, Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She addresses audiences nationally and internationally and has spoken on issues of law and justice in Ghana, England, Wales, Canada, South Africa, and before the United Nations in Geneva. Dr. Browne-Marshall is an award-winning legal correspondent and playwright of 7 produced plays. She has appeared on BBC, CNN, CBS, NPR, and C-SPAN, and her columns on the Supreme Court have been syndicated nationwide. She is the author of several books, including The Voting Rights War, the NAACP and the Ongoing Struggle for Justice, and Race, Law, and the American Society, 1607 to Present. Her forthcoming book, which can be pre-ordered on Amazon, I'll have you all know, is titled She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law, and Power, 1619 to 1969, and she is currently working on a documentary film titled She Took Justice to accompany the book. She is also the host of the weekly radio talk show Law of the Land with our own Andy was on just recently. Dr. Browne-Marshall is a member of the Bar of the Supreme Court of the United States and a fellow of the American Bar Foundation. She has been the recipient of several honors, including the Ida B. Wells Barnett Justice Award for her work with civil rights, social justice, and women's equality issues, and the Wiley College Women of Excellence in Law Award. This year, she received a Pulitzer Center grant to conduct investigative journalism. She is a member of many organizations, including the National Association of Black Journalists, the PEN American Center, Society of Journalists, the American Bar Association, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, the National Press Club, and the National Bar Association. I could go on forever about her accomplishments, but needless to say, we are delighted to have Dr. Browne-Marshall speak to us this evening, and she has kindly agreed to take questions after her presentation. We ask that those in the audience to please use the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat, and if you'd like to submit a question. And now it truly is my real pleasure to welcome Dr. Browne-Marshall. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you, Marilyn, Andy, and Leslie. And thank you. I know that this is a difficult time in our country and around the world, but this is also a national election year. This is a US Census year. This is, as you know, the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote, but it's also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment granting Black men the right to vote in 1870. And today is U.S. Constitution Day. On this day, September 17th, in 1787, our U.S. Constitution was drafted and signed. It was later ratified in 1789. However, at that time, women were not considered to be equal to men and have the mental capability to be worthy of the vote. People of color were also considered unworthy of the vote, even though there were certain isolated incidents in which there were voters who were women, voters of color, who could vote in places like New Jersey, but that ended pretty quickly. Today is also a time period in which we have Kamala Harris, who is the first African-American woman as a vice presidential candidate on a major ticket. However, she's not the first African-American to be on a presidential ticket. Only the other ticket was the Progressive Party, and that person was Carlotta Bass in the 1950s. African-American women have done exceptionally well, given the fact that there have been so many obstacles. Obstacles of race, as well as obstacles of gender. I want to start with a quote from Alice Paul, when she said, "We women of America tell you that America is not a democracy." And back then, it was not a democracy because 20 million women are denied the right to vote. Alice Paul, a suffragette, well known in your area because of her connections to Ridgefield. But Alice Paul was also someone who had some issues with the African-American female who was also risking her life for the right to vote. How did we come from such diverse backgrounds? How did we come through so many obstacles? How did we have so many entanglements between white women and Black women, between men and women, and this situation that would, and on its first look, be impossible for anyone to overcome, especially given what we know was chattel slavery in this country, to rise up as Black women have in every area of American life. We are in the boardrooms, we are on the basketball courts in professional basketball, we are ballerinas, we are astrophysicists. Those of you who saw the film, Hidden Figures, know that we have been mathematicians who have actually assisted in the moon landings. We have been a part of American life in every shape and form. How were Black women able to take this massive step forward? Or was it a massive step forward? Or did this country finally realize what Black women had to offer? And especially politically, Black women vote at the highest rate in this country. Black women voters vote at the highest rate in this country. Black women voters are very stable and dependable voters. And the organizational skills, the grassroots organizational skills of Black women, those skills are exceptional by far. All of this has a connection 100 years ago, 200 years ago, maybe even further. And so to give you the story behind the ascent of the Black woman and what you may see as something highly unusual, or some of you might just take it for granted. When Michelle Obama became First Lady of the United States, she was a lawyer. Law had a lot to do with this. My area is law. I teach constitutional law. And so it's going to be a way to look at Black women, Black suffragettes, and the arrival from before we could vote to the ascendancy to the highest offices, and perhaps, depending on what happens in the future, an African-American female U.S. Supreme Court justice. But how did we do this? In my book, She Took Justice, we'll see, little by little, how the African-American woman had to overcome obstacles, even those obstacles that you would assume where there would be allies, the white woman, for example, or even the Black man. But sometimes those allies did not exist, and she had to do it on her own. So let's take a peek back in history. And I promise you, even though we're going to look at 400 years of history, it'll only feel like a very short period of time. Trust me when I say this, because it's important for us to understand that the African-American woman didn't start off in slavery, even though we began a lot of American history with the African-American enslaved. The African-American was one of, if not the first, civilizations in this world. The first, if not the first, the African-American civilization, the African-American university system, the African-American warrior queens. These warrior queens were known not only for their diplomatic skills, but also for their courage. We know that last year, this country commemorated the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Africans in the Virginia colony. 400 years, that was 1619, they arrived in Virginia. However, from which did they come? That's what we have to think about when we talk about the African-American woman and what was in her DNA in the first place that would allow her to have the perseverance and the courage, the creativity and the tenacity to rise up into these positions of political power. How did she go from Black suffragette to a person who was wielding high political power? Well, she had political power before we had slavery. If we go back to Queen Nzinga was a warrior queen in what we now call Angola, Africa. She was a warrior queen. She was born to a king, and this king is the one who was the Ngola, N-G-O-L-A, the Ngola. And because his title was Ngola, they named the country Angola, A-N-G-O-L-A. The name of the country at that time was Ndongo, and the landscape was massive. And yet she learned by watching her father and his diplomatic skills with other heads of states. So when the Portuguese arrived in Angola, in Ndongo at the time, and they took over the country, she watched her father try to negotiate with the Portuguese. And later, when her father died and in Queen Nzinga's brother took over as king, she saw that he was ill-equipped to negotiate for their country. So if you can imagine, in the 1620s, Queen Nzinga is negotiating a peace treaty with the Portuguese. An African woman is negotiating a peace treaty with the Portuguese. This must be understood, and you can better see the strength, perseverance, and intellect of the African-American woman today. If you know she has always had strength, creativity, and perseverance and intellect. This was not something that was taken away from her. This was something in many instances, as with all women, we've had to hide under certain circumstances, and now you're beginning to see it in its full glory. So it was with this thought in mind that when we see the arrival of the 20 Africans in 1619 in this colony of Jamestown, in Jamestown, Virginia, these 20 Africans are men and women from Angola. There are men and women who have been kidnapped from Africa, held hostage, put into a ship, sent over to another country to be there as servants for the Portuguese. And that ship is attacked by an English privateer. And then on the high seas, there's a battle. And that battle then leads, there were two ships, and leads one ship that is taken over by the English. They're looking for a port. There's one ship left. They're looking for the English port. There's only one port. That port is Virginia. And that is how those 20 and odd Africans arrive in Virginia in 1619. That same year in 1619, we have the development of the House of Burgesses. That's the legislative body, like our Congress. They had the House of Burgesses, and that House of Burgesses was made up of men who created the laws. Now, what we need to understand about that is that when we talk about diversity, Diversity has always been a part of what we believe is the founding of America in that 1607 colony, because by 1619, we have the Powhatan Native Americans, we have the Africans from Angola, and we also have the English as well as the Irish and the Dutch, all living together in this Virginia area. So diversity has always been there. Power and the sharing of power between men and women, between people of color and Europeans, this has been the issue. And this has been the political issue. And this is the political issue that the African American woman has witnessed since 1619. So when she entered the fray of politics, it wasn't that she wasn't paying attention. She wasn't giving entree, but she was always watching the political process. And let me show you, this political process is one of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how it's been for the Africans in America and the African Americans. It's been 2 steps forward and 1 step back, with the African woman watching every step forward and every step back, learning from the process until it was time for her to enter the fray. So let's look at a couple you may or may not have heard of. This is an African couple living in the Jamestown colony. This couple, Mary and Anthony Johnson. Now, this wasn't their name when they were kidnapped from Africa and dragged against their will and held at gunpoint to be in the Virginia colony to work for free. But they gained land of their own. Yes, Mary and Anthony Johnson, an African couple in the Jamestown colony, gained land of their own, and they even had servants of their own in the 1600s. Mary and Anthony Johnson, write it down. You can find them in the history books. How do I know? Remember, my area is law. And so therefore, what I did was look up Mary and Anthony Johnson based on a tax abatement they received when their barn was burned. And so they had to list all of their property. And that's how we know Mary and Anthony Johnson are African. We know that they existed, and we know they had servants of their own. And they not only had servants, they had African as well as European servants. So this African couple had white and black servants of their own back in the 1600s. Here's the other thing that's very remarkable, and this lays the groundwork for what's going to come next. Back then, one had to own land before they could have political rights. Here's what's we can find. It's going to be this problem here that we have. Each time the rules are made and Africans and African Americans follow those rules, as soon as they reach a point of political power, the rules change. This has been happening for nearly 400 years. So Anthony Johnson, because he was a man, women couldn't vote back then. No women could vote back then. No male or no women who were white or black or Native American. As a matter of fact, the Powhatan Native Americans could vote, the women could vote within their culture. So the African culture had a culture, that civilization that was a structured culture of kings and queens. They had a structured government. The Powhatan Native Americans had a structured government, and they had people who could vote, and they had kings, and they had leaders. And so when the Europeans arrived, they believed that their culture was the only structured government, and it was not. So when it was time for the Africans to take their rightful political place and be able to have a vote, and your vote is your voice, and able to have a voice in the colony, laws were put in place that restricted their rights. Laws were put in place to crush the behaviors that would normally be available, and the talents that they could deliver were then subjected into chattel slavery. And chattel slavery, chattel slave is a chattel property, which means movable property. So when we go forward, I don't want you to believe that people sat back and said, I'm just going to take this oppression. They didn't. And so when Mary and Anthony Johnson finally had to leave the colony, they started another life in Maryland. So they had to start all over again and leave their land. And they also left behind their political power, because now the times had changed to prevent people of African descent from having any real role in politics. But did they stop all Africans? Did it stop all people? No. There were many Africans who still engaged or attempted to engage in methods of political representation. And one person I think is very important for you to know about, if you didn't know about him already, his name was Wentworth. And Wentworth was actually the first, by record that we know of, to have a political office. This is an African man in 1768. Wentworth Chaswell in Newmarket, New Hampshire, ran for the office of constable and was elected. Wentworth Chaswell in 1768. So although it was very difficult, African Americans were looking at the political process and attempting to figure out where they would enter. Remember, we talked about the Constitution, and the Constitution was ratified, as we said, in 1789. Women were watching this Constitution. They were watching the process, and they were looking at how it was created and how men did this. But there was another woman who was watching this process as well, and her name was Mum Bet. And she was an enslaved African. And she was someone who in Massachusetts said, after she was treated horribly by her slave mistress, a white woman, she went to a lawyer. Yes, we have an African woman going to a lawyer in the 1780s and suing for her freedom. She said, if the Massachusetts Constitution is supposed to give freedom to these other people from King George, then why isn't it giving freedom to me? And do you know, she won her lawsuit. She changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman and won her lawsuit in Massachusetts to be a free person. The reason why I think this is so very important is you want to know about agency, in this sense of having a person believe in themselves even when no one else did. So here's another lesson to be learned from Elizabeth Freeman, is that Elizabeth Freeman said, anytime while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman. This is the type of perseverance. This is the type of tenacity and dedication that Black women had, even while they were enslaved. So once again, this idea of the African-American woman as something new when it comes to her bursting on the political scene, she always had this inside of her, but the society would not allow it to come out. So there were exceptional women like Elizabeth Freeman who broke through this. And we're going to talk about more of these exceptional women who broke free despite what was happening around them, and learning more and more about how Elizabeth Freeman in 1780 could fight for her rights. And white women, as well as women of color, are watching the political process, realizing they had no voice in their community, no voice in their society. And the Constitution itself had a fugitive slave clause. So when we have women, African women, who escape, there's a fugitive slave clause in our Constitution that gives rights to the bounty hunters to come on behalf of the slave owners to bring these women back. So there were African women who were putting their lives at risk to escape for freedom. They wanted to have a freedom and equality even back then. They were not sitting back, just allowing things to happen to them. And even though many people were enslaved, and there were many people who did not rise up all of the time, there are enough instances in American history to show us that the African-American woman was always in her heart thinking of herself as a full, complete person, even if the laws didn't see her that way. The same way we have white women who are looking at this Constitution and understanding that it's all about men, that all men are created equal. And these women are saying, well, what about me? Why am I not included in this Constitution? And why am I not included as far as equality goes? And not every woman was thinking this. And not every woman was rising up. And that's why we have these exceptional women who are called the suffragettes we know by name. But there were many other women in their own way who were trying to also break free of these legal chains that have been placed on them based on their gender. So we want to talk about one of the first Black female suffragettes who is well known. As I said, there are other women, but who's very well known. And this is Sojourner Truth. Now, Sojourner Truth did not have that name when she was born. Her name was Bumpus, and she was someone who was enslaved in upstate New York. And she was a tall woman. She knew her own mind very young. And she decided at a certain point that she had worked long enough. New York had abolished slavery, but many of the slave owners didn't tell the enslaved. Back during that time period, enslaved people were not allowed to read or write on penalty of death. I want you to understand, and this is very important, when you learn as you know, it opens up the world. You begin to question things. You begin to see things in a new light. And that is not what they wanted the African to do. They did not want the African to learn how to read, write, to think, to be. They were thinking anyway, but they couldn't even show that they had thoughts of their own. They had to keep everything inside. But the book opens up the entire world. And that's why if they were caught reading, they could be killed. And even if there was a kind white person who wanted to teach them how to read, that white person could be jailed just for teaching an African how to read. So many of them were illiterate, except for trying, if they could, little by little to learn words that they could read here and there. Sojourner Truth never really learned how to read or write, but she knew in her heart that she was equal to everyone and she was equal under God. And so what she did was walk off the plantation one day. They said Sojourner Truth escaped. Sojourner Truth said, I didn't escape, I left. I left. I had worked long enough and I wasn't going to work anymore. She found a very kind-hearted white couple not too far away who took her in. So sometimes this is not always about Black and white. Sometimes you can find a kind person. There have been many kind and generous white people who have worked on behalf of those people who are fighting for justice. There haven't been as many as there should. Too many have stayed quiet and watched injustices happen, then as well as now. But this white couple took Sojourner Truth in. And after that, she said, I am a free person. And that white couple actually paid off the slave master so that she would not have to go back and work for him ever again. That type of kindness we see happen throughout history. Sojourner Truth became a minister, but she also became a suffragette. Before it was even called suffragette, she was saying she was equal to any man. At the same time, you have white women who have decided enough is enough. And they have the meeting that you're very familiar with in Seneca Falls in upstate New York in 1848. Here's the thing that's really interesting about that meeting from an African-American perspective. There were white women, white men, but no Black women. But there was one Black man, Frederick Douglass. And it's been said that Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were very close friends, and that Frederick Douglass said he implored them, you must ask for the vote, for suffrage, and that's what it's called. It's not suffering, but it's called suffrage, the right to vote. And so Frederick Douglass was known to be a supporter of the woman's right to vote from the very beginning, that he thought that it was important that women have the right to vote. But something becomes of concern, and that is the racial segregation between white women and Black women. Now, both of these groups of women are asking for the right to vote. However, white women have a sense of prejudice because this was also during the time period of slavery. So even though some states had abolished enslavement, there was still the sense that white women thought that they should not be around Black women, that Black women were not their equals. So it's really a form of hypocrisy that white women see themselves as equal to the man, and the man felt that women were not equal to men, white or Black women were not equal to men. And when the white woman was asking for the right to vote, the Black woman is asking for the right to vote too, and the right to be seen as equal to all people. So they had the same interests at heart, but there was always this racial division where the white woman believed that she was better than the Black woman and better than all women of color. And this comes to a head with one of the major speeches of Sojourner Truth in Akron, Ohio in 1851, where we have white women who are asking for the right to vote. They're having conventions and conferences and coming together. And so there are all these Black women who are also, like Sojourner Truth, saying, well, why aren't you including us? This is something that we all need, we all want. And so Sojourner Truth stands before that group of the convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851 and says, ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Because if we're doing something on behalf of women, I too am a woman. So we should be in this together. And this issue of the inclusion or exclusion of Black women becomes an ongoing issue that we're still wrestling with today. And this becomes a heated issue as we get closer to the Civil War. We have women who are, of course, protesting for the right to vote, different strategies, white women with different strategies for the right to vote. We also have the temperance movement. And the temperance movement is a movement around an anti-alcohol movement. As the world is changing and this country is changing, we're seeing a lot of these girls and women coming from the countryside into the cities, and they're unprotected, and they're being violated and taken advantage of by men. And the temperance movement is looking at alcohol as the reason why men are getting drunk, they're abusing other women, they're leaving their families. And so there's been this anti-alcohol movement. And the saying goes that lips that have touched liquor will not touch mine. And so that's the temperance movement. And there's this intermingling of the temperance movement and the suffragette movement. But that's an intermingling that's also taking place in the Black female community, because although there's still enslavement, remember Mary and Anthony Johnson were free. There have always been free Black people in this country. The population was not as large as the enslaved Black population, but that free Black population was always there. And they were always petitioning, they were taking into account what rights they had under law, pushing the envelope as far as expansion of those rights and trying as best they could to be treated as equal in the community. So when we get to the time period into the 1860s, it's the entree into the Civil War. The Civil War takes place between 1861 and 1865. It's very important that we understand in 1863, when President Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, that proclamation gives absolute equality to all Africans. Absolute equality to all Africans. The order that is given, and you heard about Juneteenth, that was, by the time this order reached Texas, and it was in June, even though the order was sent out in January, the slaveholders didn't want to let these African men and women and children go. Without the help of the African soldier fighting on behalf of the Union Army, President Lincoln has said that the North would have lost. This then is something that Frederick Douglass has said time and time again. The African has earned the right to vote. The African male was responsible for the Union being saved. It's the ballot or the bullet. What are we going to do for these African men that's going to show that we have gratitude for what they have done to save the Union? However, white suffragettes were appalled. And one of the major friendships between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass was strained over this. Susan B. Anthony, of course, a very well-known suffragette. And the white women said, no, by the time this war ends in 1865 and slavery is ended with the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery except as punishment for a crime, and we'll come back to that. So slavery is abolished with the end of the war except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment, the first line of the 14th Amendment gives citizenship at birth. We have equal protection and due process, all for the African. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created for the African. And then the 15th Amendment was the debatable issue, whether or not the Black men should receive the right to vote or the Black women or both. It was thought that it would be too controversial to have the Black men and the Black women receive the right to vote at the same time. The white suffragettes were appalled. Not all of them, some of them supported the African Americans' right to vote, but others said, as Susan B. Anthony did, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman. So there were intense and very destructive words that are now quotes that we read, and people say, well, we can't take those out of context, but we have to understand the reply to this is what Frederick Douglass said to his friend, Susan B. Anthony. And this is, I quote Frederick Douglass, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then women will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own, end quote. So you see, there were a lot of tensions around the African vote, the African American male, I should say, and the white woman's vote, the white woman's vote or woman's vote. The major issues were who should come first. President Grant wanted the African male to have his vote first, and that's what happened. That animosity lingered in the air. The animosity between the white suffragettes and the Black suffragettes over the Black male receiving the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted the Black men the right to vote. It was thought that within a few years, white women would receive the right to vote as well. And that didn't happen. And that angered a number of the suffragettes. But I also want to speak to at this time the backlash that Black men received to the political power they had at the time. The Black vote has been able to change the outcome of an election since the time Black men began to vote in 1870. In 1870, there were Black male US senators, Black male US House of Representatives. They went into their offices in the 1870s into the 1880s. So Barack Obama was not the first Black US senator. There were Black US senators and Black men in Congress. There were Black lieutenant governors. There were Black men in state assemblies. There were Black men as post office general. There were Black men in so many different political offices. It's been said that there were over 4,000 Black men in political offices between 1870 and 1890. But then there was also the backlash. And the backlash to that was the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations like the John Birch Society. there were massive lynchings. So the first request for anti-lynching legislation was in the 1800s. We've also had recently a request for anti-lynching legislation that still hasn't been passed. It wasn't passed then, and it's not passed now. The backlash was also racial segregation under law. But the Black woman had a lot of work to do. Remember, there was a very high illiteracy rate based on the fact that enslaved people could not learn to read or write under penalty of law. So they had the Black woman who, as these Black people were set free, given nothing, no 40 acres and a mule, nothing, even though there were requests for reparations, even as early as the 1880s, Black people were giving nothing. So from 1619 to 1865, all of that work for free, all that profit given to this country, and nothing for them to show for it, except the skill, the tenacity, the creativity, and the intellect they always had. And so what we have by 1872, for example, we have some of the first Black female lawyers. Yes, Charlotte Ray graduates from Howard Law School, because we have colleges during that time too. Howard, we have Spelman, Wilberforce, we have a number of colleges, Tuskegee Institute, Hampton Institute. Yes, we have educated Black men and women in the 1800s. Black people didn't first start going to school during the civil rights period of the 1950s. They went in larger numbers, but they started going to colleges and law schools. And these law schools are preparing these Black women for political attainment. However, no woman can vote at this time. Even though law cases are being brought in which white women are attempting to access the vote, they are being rebuffed again and again by the US Supreme Court in these attempts. We also have massive murders of Black men and women who are attempting to organize to better use their right to vote. So by the time we get to Mary Church Terrell, and we get to the Ida B. Wells Barnett. And Ida B. Wells Barnett is not just a Black suffragette like Mary Church Terrell, but she's also someone who's looking at this issue of lynching. And she is looking at the issue of lynching because the issue of lynching is being used by white suffragettes to leverage political power in the South. Now, they're saying that Black men are being lynched because they're raping white women. Ida B. Wells Barnett is in Tennessee, the same Tennessee we see with Breonna Taylor right now. And they're looking, or Kentucky that we see with Breonna Taylor, but in Tennessee, where we have this Southern sense that as far as Black people are concerned, they are supposed to stay below the white person. So the white suffragettes are saying, well, if you give us the right to vote as women, white women, we'll outnumber the Black man, and that way we'll keep white political supremacy. And they're saying this in quote after quote. And unfortunately, Frances Willard, who is a white suffragette, and Alice Paul are looking at this sense of what should the white woman suffragette do politically, strategically, in order to gain the votes needed to amend the US Constitution and grant her the right to vote. And to amend the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the states to allow that amendment to go through. So they're looking at this politically from the white suffragettes standpoint, but Ida B. Wells Barnett is saying, wait a minute, 1 minute, I'm doing an analysis of this and I'm finding that Black women are being lynched. And if you have a chance to find the photo of Mary Turner, you will find this is a Black woman who was lynched, hanging from a bridge. She was pregnant, her belly split open, the fetus thrown on the ground and stomped by men's boots. These are the things that are happening to Black women. that are not happening to white women. Going back to what Frederick Douglass was saying, he was making it clear that the obstacles of race far exceed the obstacles of gender that white women are encountering. So as we go forward, the Colfax Massacre in 1873 is a massacre in which nearly 200 Black people are murdered by whites, and the Supreme Court and the other courts do nothing. Nothing. And they're murdered because they had voted and their vote had turned the outcome of the election, which leads us to 1890, because it's understood by this time, and if you don't understand it, you should. Even in our election today, the Black vote is essential for particular candidates to win. And if the Black vote stays home, it's going to be very difficult for particular candidates to win, and other candidates are more assured of winning. Here's what they understood in 1890. And we get this from the quote of Vardaman. And Vardaman is a senator, and James Kimball Vardaman says, well, we're going to enact legislation in each state. And the legislation is called the Mississippi Plan. And the Mississippi Plan was to put in place obstacles to stop the Black vote. And I quote, "There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's constitutional convention was held not for no other purpose than to eliminate the N-word." Yes, to eliminate the Negro, N-word, from politics, not the ignorant, but the N-word. It was made very clear that they were afraid of Black political power. So by 1896, we have the Supreme Court rule in Plessy versus Ferguson that the entire country will be segregated by race. Not just Black and white, but all people of color will be segregated in separate schools, will be segregated in separate housing. There'll be, even the cemeteries were segregated. The hospitals were segregated. Every aspect of American social life was segregated. And this is the effect on politics. Louisiana, where Plessy versus Ferguson was, where the case arose, in 1890, when the Mississippi Plan was started, and the Mississippi Plan meant the grandfather clause, which meant that if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote. If the Black person couldn't vote in your family before 1865, then no one else in the family could vote. This is when they decided to institute literacy tests, where people had to take a test before they could register to vote. They had poll taxes, where you had to pay a tax before you could register to vote. And all of this was put in place, as you heard from that Mississippi governor and senator, because of the Negro. The Black vote was that powerful. This is before the Black women were part of that. And as the Black man was navigating the political process, it was the Black woman who was putting in place the types of organizations like the Ida B. Wells Barnett Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, and the National Association of Colored Women that Mary Church Terrell, a Black suffragette, also organized. These organizations in 1908, the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, but the Delta Sigma Theta sorority was the more political group of African American college women, and that sorority was a sorority in which they began to have strategies to determine how the Black woman could receive the right to vote. The number of lynchings began to increase, but Black women were determined to receive the right to vote because their communities needed the social services. They needed to have a voice in their community so they could re-elect and some sheriffs that would better suit their conditions, and diselect some sheriffs who were standing by, allowing them to be lynched and raped and assaulted. They needed to have a voice as to the Board of Education and how their children would be educated. They needed to have a voice in politics so that they could better protect themselves when it came to their land and their interests. So they knew the importance of the right to vote. So they were there in 1913 when Alice Paul led that march, protesting around the White House the fact that Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, would not even think about granting the women the right to vote, and actually opposed the right to vote for women. And so when there were riots against these white women, the idea of the Black woman's right to vote was something that was also, that should have been of concern. They should have come together and it would have been more powerful. But when Alice Paul had that march around in 1913, she refused to allow Black women to march. She was so afraid that the white Southern women would be insulted by having Black women in the march, that she said no to Black women. But Ida B. Wells Barnett marched then anyway. So you see this constant debate, this constant argument, this constant, schism between Black and white women suffragettes going for the same thing, but race being this dividing line. So when we have the coming together of the men and women necessary to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920, it was thought that Black women would now finally have a voice. But remember, going back to Louisiana, in 1890, during the year of the Mississippi Plan, there were over 100,000 Black men registered to vote in Louisiana, where the case arose of Plessy versus Ferguson. Because of that case, and because of the Mississippi Plan that was instituted in states across the country, by 1900 in Louisiana, there were only 5,000 registered Black men. There were lynchings, terrorism, all different types of mechanisms to crush Black political progress. The fear was that when the Black woman gained her right to vote, it would be twice as powerful. So that meant they had to start attacking the Black woman. And so Black women not only came under fire before the passage of the 19th Amendment, but even after that passage. And I'm going to read this one quick letter. And this is a letter written in December of 1920. So now the 19th Amendment has only been passed by a few months, and yet the threats have already begun against Black women. This is a letter that was sent from Texas to the NAACP's New York City office. And it says, on the following Thursday, which was October the 21st, Dr. B.F. Bond and the sheriff of the county, Mr. Gregory, came to me and further threatened me. On the 28th, Mr. Heyman Dolan and Mr. Freeman, a mill owner, and Mr. Newberry came and told me, as there had never been a lynching in that part, they thought it well that I should leave at once to be sure of my life. I live in River Junction and registered in the 9th precinct, but was asked to leave before it was time to vote. Now, what really gets me is this part. I am secretary of the Harding and Coolidge Club in my home, and I was active in all things that tend to the uplift of my people. What did that include? They told me that since I was the leader of the colored people, and in the effort to have colored women register to vote, because he had colored women registered to vote as a Black man, they threatened both the Black women and the Black man with lynching. He had to leave his home never to return because he was registering Black women to vote. But did that stop the Black woman? No. The reason why was because she had already had structures in place to help her community with social services that were not being given to her by the government, to help her community with tutoring for young people so they would be able to read and write and stay in school. The services that the government did not give, Black women organized clubs to give those services. So when the Black woman was not able to enter the voting booths, when she was not able to exercise her right to vote, she continued to organize around civil rights. And so Rosa Parks and others were part of these social circles, part of these social services and the organizations that were created by these suffragettes and by now the Black woman voter, who was assisting Black men, like Oscar the Priest, who becomes a Black U.S. representative in Chicago because of the work of the then suffragette, now Black woman voter, Ida B. Wells Barnett. You have Louise Lassiter, who then is a Black woman in North Carolina, who brings a case to stop the literacy test, and she attempts to. It goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. We have Black women who are fighting to amend the U.S. Constitution, and their actions lead to the 24th Amendment that ends poll taxes so that people don't have to pay a poll tax in order to vote. You have so many Black women who are voting. You have the Congressional Black Caucus that is made up of Black men and women after Shirley Chisholm becomes the first Black U.S. representative who is female representing Brooklyn. So Black women break the political ceiling with Shirley Chisholm's rise in 1969, becoming the first Black woman in Congress. And from there, she runs for president of the United States. Yes, Shirley Chisholm runs for president of the United States as a Black woman. So Kamala Harris is not that first person. Barbara Jordan, who is also a congresswoman, Black woman from Texas, runs for president of the United States. You continuously have these Black women. Patricia Roberts Harris becomes the first Black woman who has a seat in government as Secretary of Health and Human Services under Jimmy Carter. These Black women continue to ascend, more Black lawyers, more Black women who are running for office until you get to where we are now. But the backlash is always there. And that backlash is photo ID laws that make it more difficult for people to have photo identification. They're closing down the places where people can get photo identification. The civil death. A civil death means that a person is alive, but they're dead politically because they have a felony conviction. And the United States is one of only a handful of countries that prohibits a person from voting because they have a felony conviction. And in Florida right now, if people have a fine, they're not allowed to vote if they have a fine and they can't pay the fine. That is so similar to the poll tax. There are so many ways in which voter suppression is continuing to suppress the Black vote, because in this election, as in every election since Black men have gained the right to vote in 1870, and Black women ascended to their right to vote in 1920, there's always been this sense of the power of the Black vote and the need for those people to better understand what the Black politician, the Black woman has to offer our democracy. I want to end with this quote from Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth said, "If women want more rights than they got, why don't they just take them and not be talking about it?" That is what the Black woman has been doing. She takes justice, even in the face of oppression, and will continue to do so with perseverance, with intellect, with creativity, and of course, with a love of community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gloria. You know, I had a whole list of questions, but you covered everything so well. It's sort of difficult to ask something because pointing out the 15th Amendment, I think that was really turned the tide when you think of the abolitionists who were so supportive of Black people getting the vote, and then the 15th Amendment sort of turned everything on its side. And I think you described that very well. Are there any particular women whom you haven't discussed? You've talked about Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and Sojourner Truth. Are there any that you think we would enjoy learning about or need to learn about?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention Maria Stewart. And so Maria Stewart was a writer and educator, abolitionist. And people ask us, you have, well, how do you do so many things? These women did so many things back then. And so Maria Stewart was also one to address the African-American, and this is what really gets me, the African-American Female Intelligence Society. Now, keep in mind, when we think about the African-American journey, too many people think that African-Americans just became intelligent in the last 20 years. As I said before, we began with Queen Nzinga, who was a diplomat and a warrior queen. So to have an organization back in 1832, the organization, the African-American Female Intelligence Society, and this was located in Boston. We also had Mary Ann Shad, and she was born in 1823 to 1893. She was an abolitionist, educator, and she also started her own newspaper. And this was in Ontario, Canada. And she became the first Black female publisher. And what she would publish would be the news around the Suffragettes movement. And also one of my favorites, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was not just a suffragette, she was also an abolitionist. She was a poet, an educator. She would give speeches around the country. And one of her speeches, The Education and Elevation of the Colored Race. And she has poems, and you can find her poems on miscellaneous subjects. And that poem, her book of poetry, sold over 10,000 copies in her day. So when we talk about some of these suffragettes, there are many, many more, but I think those, of course, of a note that people need to know: Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Ann Shad, and Maria Stewart.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit, Gloria, about the Voting Rights Act and how how it's sort of been stripped now, how that's impacting current times?
Well, I think this is good to understand that my book, The Voting Rights War, voting rights has been a war. The war around voting rights has been from the very beginning. And even when it was not a war involving race, it was a war involving class. It was a war involving the immigrant becoming a naturalized citizen. It was thought that this country should be a white country. So when we talk about America, we assume that it's always been majority European, and that's not true. This country, of course, started off majority Native American, and places like in the 1800s, places like South Carolina were majority African. And so in the Constitution, when you see the 3/5 rule, the 3/5 rule was created by the framers to determine the number and the population for the decision as to how many representatives from that state would go to Congress. And so the African was considered 3/5 of a person. And if you see the Article 1 of the Constitution, you can read about the 3/5 rule. That's what it was, to count the African as 3/5 of a person for the sake of the population, to determine how many representatives would come from the state, from each state. So it's not as though these Africans were receiving, who were enslaved during that time period, of course, who were receiving any type of political representation. That becomes very, and I'll go back to the Voting Rights Act in a moment, but that's something else we see that's a modern day voter suppression, and that's the use of prisons in the prison industrial complex. And we find people who are incarcerated, their population is counted in the town where the prison or jail is located. It's counted in the town. So that prisoner population is counted in that town. And that means that town receives more state, local, and federal funding because of that prison population. And so it's another version of the 3/5 rule that's taking place, because it's not as though those political representatives are asking the incarcerated how they could be better served. They're just using the physical body of the incarcerated to get their own political expediency and political ambitions served. And of course, bring more money into their town. Going back to the Voting Rights War and the Voting Rights Act, because of death, destruction, because of outright carnage of the Black community, despite all of this, And we saw this on anybody who has a chance to watch that film clip on YouTube or any other place of the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that bloody Sunday in March of 1965. It was filmed around the world, actually. That film has been seen around the world, but especially around this country. And that, of course, is a scene in which John Lewis, who just passed away, the civil rights icon, was beaten along with Black women and children on that bridge. It was after the murder of the three college students in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So many things had taken place to lead to President Johnson to say that we need a Voting Rights Act. And so that Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. However, it had one of the clearest, most miraculous legal provisions of any civil rights legislation, and that is the pre-clearance clause. And the pre-clearance clause in the act meant that before any jurisdiction that was, for example, one that had been shown before to discriminate against Black voters and other voters of color, before they could make any laws or any changes in their laws, they had to have it pre-cleared by a 3-judge court or by the U.S. Attorney General. Well, the U.S. Attorney General, by the time this case comes to court of Shelby County versus Holder, is Eric Holder, a Black man. This is during the time of President Obama, a Black man. And this U.S. Supreme Court that has never, and this whole time, as I talked about before, when we've had the 1870, the Colfax Massacre of 1873, that case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court finds against the Black people who have been victims and allows the white men who have been the murderers to go free. We find case after case leading up to Plessy versus Ferguson. Once again, the U.S. Supreme Court turned its back on the Black population, turns its back on the Constitution, and upholds white superiority. And so what we have with the case of Shelby County versus Holder is the U.S. Supreme Court upholding the racial biases of Alabama, despite all the evidence showing that there's racial discrimination in voting there. And so in June of 2013, that pre-clearance provision, that miraculous part of legislation that had led to so many advances for people of color, is struck down as unconstitutional by Chief Justice Roberts. And I have to give you this aside note. Chief Justice Roberts, when he was an attorney, had worked on the theory to gut the Voting Rights Act of the pre-clearance provision long before he was made a judge. So it was very insincere of him to write the opinion in Shelby County versus Holder as though this is a new concept. That was his concept that he had devised many years before. And so now we're without that pre-clearance provision. People can still bring lawsuits, but these lawsuits are very expensive. They are long and they take a great deal of money. And when the case finally comes to court, it's not as though the Supreme Court is going to make whoever has won this election under false pretenses or based on discrimination stand down from their political position. So the next election, they put into place whatever has been won or whatever the court decides, but that means that people can use and abuse voting rights suppression tactics to get political gain, and there's really nothing you can do about it once they've been elected into office.
Okay, thank you. One of our questioners wants to know that said that you had mentioned reparations. Is there a plan for reparations that you would support, or what do you think about that?
The first plan for reparations that started by Callie House, C-A-L-L-I-E, House is her last name, began with a plan to give a pension to those who had been working for free all their lives and were now elderly. So it was the elderly who were going to be the focus of this pension plan, who had been enslaved during that time period, who were still alive. Some of these people who were enslaved lived well into the 1900s, if they were children at the time they were enslaved. I do believe in reparations. I thought it over, and I thought about how many times that we have, for example, in the cases involving priests who have abused children, they've extended the statute of limitation. That statute of limitation has been extended to allow, in certain rape cases, for people to be able to have money. For example, Native Americans have received certain forms of reparations for the land that is taken and the treaties that were ignored for the land masses. The Japanese received reparations for the time that they were in the internment camps during World War II. So I believe that reparations are necessary. And I was thinking, here's my sister's view of reparations. My sister, who's also a professor, would want reparations to be not paying taxes if one is of African descent, not paying taxes for, say, 5 years of not paying taxes. That way you're not giving money, but you're not paying taxes. There are other ways in which there could be reparations. For example, there could be reparations in having scholarships to universities. That could be another method of reparations. There have been so many farms that have been lost. And in my book, the Race, Law, and American Society, I talk about not just the loss of land generally, but the loss of farmland, the loss of inherited land, and that are now golf courses and subdivisions where people are living and doing well, and they're run off of their property. And as I read in that letter, so that Texas man who was run off of his property, he's not there to farm the land. He's not there to protect his family. There are so many ways in which land was lost, and I think reparation for that land, the ability to bring lawsuits again to get that land back. And the Native Americans are bringing lawsuits now to get their land back. And I think that the African Americans should be able to bring lawsuits as well to get their land back. And the last method I think to consider as a part of reparations was something called a baby bond. And a baby bond would be when a Black child is born, a certain amount of money is put as a savings bond for college. So when that child becomes 18, they have that money in the bond that they can start life with, that they can take it to start a business perhaps, or maybe go, if they want, for college tuition, they could buy a house, but they have some money by which they can start their lives. There is such an income gap because of oppression, because of race discrimination, because of the way in which generational wealth has been handled in this country. We have people of African descent who were wiped out, during this last Great Recession because of biases in the kind of loans that were given to people of African descent. And so, of course, the federal government had lawsuits against those banks and those corporations, and there were fines paid, but that money didn't go to the African Americans who lost their homes. That money didn't go to repair their bad credit ratings because their homes were foreclosed upon. So I think land, I think the baby bonds, I think the scholarships are ways in which that we could have reparations in this country that could speak to the financial undermining of people of African descent.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we're getting a little low on time, and before we go to any more questions, we're going to ask our audience, if we can, for just a moment, to answer 3 quick questions to help us with feedback to the Connecticut Humanities who have made this program and others possible. Leslie, if you could show us the polls. Here's the first question. Did you learn something new about the suffrage movement? Either answer yes or no. Okay. Mark your ballot. I'm going to go to the next question now. Did this program inspire you to reflect on your civic rights? Yes or no? If you would answer that question. And then we're going to go to the third question. Do you think the leaders of the historic suffrage movement would be satisfied with the current state of civic rights? If you could answer that, yes or no. Leslie, have we given everyone time enough to answer those questions?
A few more seconds, I believe.
Okay.
And may I add, while they're answering these questions, I would like to add this one thing. And one part of The quest for equality that women of all colors and all races and ethnicities and religions have in common is the need to join together as allies. The African American woman is a worthy ally, seeking worthy allies. And I think we should look at ourselves as allies. What are our common goals? What do we want out of our community? And I want young people to register to vote. If I could use this time to talk about registering to vote, I think that once people register to vote and they know their vote is their voice, I think they have a better sense of engagement with their government, with their communities. When they look around and they see, what do I want to change? That's why when I look at these, like Sojourner Truth, and I look at these women who were coming up in such a hard time, and they still had hope of a better society. They didn't see how it could happen. And so they figured, if I don't see how it can happen, I'm going to make it happen myself. And I think that is what we should get out of the Suffragettes movement in this 100th anniversary. If we don't see what we want to see in our communities, then we need to see, as they did, how we can make it happen and come together and know that we as women, we as a community are stronger together than we are separate. And that is what I think is important for all of us when we're looking forward. We have to look forward to the generations unborn. And when we think about Frances Willard, we think about Susan B. Anthony, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett. These women lived to know that women like us, they never knew our names, but they lived to know that women like us would one day exist. And we have to do that for the future girls and future women. We have to fight the fight for the women we'll never know, the women and girls we'll never meet. We have to invest in a future that's beyond our lifetimes. That's what the suffragettes did. And I think that's what's most important and what we can gain from their experience.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Browne-Marshall. This has been an extraordinary experience. Bringing us back from 400 years ago to 1619, when the Johnsons first came to live, and bringing it all the way up to the current time has really made an interesting and thoughtful presentation. And I don't know, Andy, do we have any more time, or it looks like we might be running out of time now?
Yes.
What do we have?
I think we're running
close
to the end. I did want to mention on the topic of voter registration that there will be the opportunity on Tuesday, September 22nd. It's National Voter Registration Day, and the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield will be outside of the library in the afternoon on Tuesday. And if you haven't registered to vote, you want to update your address, you can even change your party registration if you are so inclined. Please do stop by and learn more about what will be on the general election ballot on Tuesday, on National Voter Registration Day.
Well,
I just want to remind folks that they can also go to the League's website and learn more about voter resources in Ridgefield, how to register to vote online, how on November 3rd you have an option of voting in person, or you have the option of voting absentee. Absentee ballots have already been sent to all registered voters in Ridgefield, and you can fill that out, send it back, and the town clerk will send you back a ballot starting October 2nd. I want to assure you that there is a safe poll plan in Connecticut for every location, and please feel free to go to the polls because it's going to be safe. The most important thing, as Dr. Browne-Marshall has stated, and we have all stated, is you need to register and you need to vote. Every voice counts. And we want to thank you all for coming this evening. Dr. Browne-Marshall, do you have anything, parting words for us?
Yes, history is power. Your vote is power. You should be feeling mighty powerful. But if you're overwhelmed by everything, remember Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a Black woman sharecropper who was beaten registering to vote, but she registered to vote anyway, and she got others to register to vote, and she protested to get that vote. And if you're one of these people who has her sentiment, you should remember, she said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. So if
I
you're
think
sick and
that's
tired of being sick and tired, that's another reason why you need to get out there and vote and make it happen.
I think that's a perfect way to end this webinar. We thank you again so much. We thank our audience for coming, and we thank the library for hosting a whole bevy of fantastic 19th Amendment commemoration events, and we encourage you to go onto the Votes for Women website with the Ridgefield Library and look at the remaining programs. And thank you again, and we look forward to hearing more about you, Dr. Browne-Marshall, and reading your new book. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.